Week 14's on its way tonight, and here's a few quarterbacks I'm going to bench here heading into Week 14. The first guy's Kirk Cousins of the Minnesota Vikings. Cousins, he's been on a great run of late, is Cousins, but this week I just don't like the matchup for him versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But Cousins, he's been on a good roll, like I said, but this game, I think it's going to be a tight ball game, or a game where Dalvin Cook has the ball a lot in his hands and he gets most of the scores. Cousins, I know he has two great receivers over there with Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, but this week versus Tampa Bay, I just think Cousins will have a mediocre game at best. Maybe I could be wrong, but I just don't see it happening. Tampa had the week off now. They're going to come back, and Cousins, some owners have dropped him. His percentage went down 3%, and in this game, I'm going to say he gets anywhere from 250 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 windows. That's a decent ball game. But I just don't like the matchup this week, and there's better options out there. So bench Cousins. The second guy I'm benching at quarterback is Cam Newton at the New England Patriots. Cam Newton here, he plays tonight versus a tough Los Angeles Ram team that gives up the least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. And Newton, I could see a mediocre type of game here from him. 175 yards about passing, 50, 60 yards rushing with a touchdown and an into, and that's not going to get the job done. Like I've said for weeks though, Newton, his ceiling is 25 points. It's been, and his low could be really low. There's a game this year where he had negative fantasy points. Then 2 weeks ago versus Arizona, we saw him have 3.5 fantasy points. So Newton, I can't trust him tonight. It's a road game as well. He plays way better at home, and I don't think he gets the job done versus a tough Ram defense. The next guy I'm benching is Jared Goff in the same game. This game, I see a defensive battle and a game that could go either way. And Jared Goff, he's a guy I really can't depend on either. Goff, I know he had a huge game last week at Arizona with 351 passing yards, 1 touchdown and a rushing touchdown. But Goff, he don't get many touchdowns. It seems like most of the running backs run that ball in for this team. Goff, he gets the yards, but versus New England, who gives up the third least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks this week, I just don't trust Goff. We saw him in Week 12 have a 3-point fantasy day. Then he came back last week with 26. This week, I think he'll get 13 to 18 range, and there's better options out there. So bench Goff. The fourth quarterback I'm benching is Derek Carr of the Vegas Raiders. It was a great game last week for Carr versus a weak New York Jet defense, and that's why he had the huge game, in my opinion. Now he's got a tough matchup versus the Indianapolis Colts that give up the second least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks, and we saw Carr a few weeks ago versus Atlanta in Week 12, where we thought he was going to have a huge game then, and he only had 0.6. So this guy, it seems like he's an every other game type of fantasy player. In this game, I could see him have a low in this one with 10 to 15 fantasy points. So Derek Carr, he's a guy owned in 50% of leagues, but he's a guy I can't trust, especially versus this Colts defense heading into a playoff game. And the fifth and final guy I'm benching this week's at quarterback is Teddy Bridgewater of the Carolina Panthers. Bridgewater, he's been banged up over the last few weeks, but he's gutted it out, only missing 1 game, and now coming off the bye. He's got a middle-of-the-pack matchup versus the Denver Broncos, but just like these other guys, Teddy Bridgewater, he's inconsistent as well. There's way better options out there, in my opinion, and Bridgewater, he didn't even crack my top 15 in quarterback rankings this week, so check that video out if you haven't. So Bridgewater, I see another mediocre game from him like he had versus Minnesota in Week 12. He was 267, a passing touchdown, and 12 yards rushing and an into. Something along those lines I see Bridgewater doing. Christian McCaffrey should be back, and I think he's going to get a heavy workload. And plus, he's out without DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel, most likely in this game. So I'm benching Bridgewater, and that's 5 quarterbacks I'm benching here for Week 14.